Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. I got to learn how to figure out how this microphone works. Thank you, Pastor, for opening up your church for this event. It occurred because someone called me and said, you know something, we ought to have a community meeting. And I thought, no, she's right. So that led to coming here to the Methodist Temple and giving us an opportunity tonight to talk about an issue. I talked in this place in 2002 around the issue of going into Iraq. And it seems sort of eerie to me in a way to be talking here tonight about a similar kind of issue. We hear that there is a proposal that we go in to have a limited strike in Syria to show the world that we as Americans are unaccepting of the idea of the use of chemical weapons, and that the world must know that that's not a civil way to relate to one another in war or anything else. And yet the consequences of a limited strike, I think, and the wider war that may come from that are troubling a lot of us. Murphy's Law of unintended consequences is well known. And often when things start off in a certain direction, they wind up in another. You may remember Iraq, we were going to be in and out in 60 days. And lo and behold, 10 years later, we were still enmeshed. And I think that for someone like me who represents 700,000 people like you, it is a heavy responsibility to try and decide what one ought to do. And for that reason, I wanted to have this meeting, and I appreciate all of your coming. The President made his proposal several weeks ago after the events that occurred in Damascus suburbs, and was prepared, really, I believe, to go by himself. He thought that he, as the president, could make the decision and would move forward. But some of us immediately raised the issue, as we had done before with George Bush. You have to get authorization from the Congress to make this kind of step forward. And after a few days of thinking about that, the president did decide that he would wait until he had approached the Congress and let the Congress take a vote on this issue. Now, Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government until you consider the alternatives. It's messy, it's loud, it's noisy, it's a lot of things, but it is developing a consensus among the people about what we as a people should do. And this is you're a part of that process in this issue now. Now, the Senate has voted, as you have seen, 10-7 in committee to authorize the president's moving forward. The original proposal made from the White House was a very wide, broad, sweeping one, somewhat like what we were asked early to vote on in Iraq. I remember very well when we came to that vote, there were 15 or so of us standing in the back of the hall. Only one person voted no. Barbara Lee voted no. But there were another 15 of us or so standing around saying, how am I going to explain when I go home that I voted no? I mean, here we've been attacked in New York. Shouldn't we do something? And even though this seems like a very broad authorization for the president, we were back and forth about it. And that is where we are again. We know that there's something that we do not accept, a heinous act in Damascus, but the question is, what should you do about that? Now, my belief is that what will happen when we go back, I'm leaving tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, I'll be back in Washington, D.C. This week, the Senate will be dealing with this issue. They will be debating what has come out of committee on the floor of the Senate. There's possibilities for filibusters. There's possibilities for multiple amendments by various people who want either to go further, because there are certainly some people who think that the resolution that passed in the Senate is too narrow, and there are others who think that it ought to be even more narrow. So the possibility for amendments in the Senate are quite obvious. The week will quickly go by. There's Jewish high holidays beginning on sundown on Thursday, and so it'll be a short week. So it won't get done this week. Then we'll move to the next week. The Senate will either take its vote this week or next week early, and then the House will get down to making a decision about what we think about it. I made a suggestion. The President, his staff, Mr. Pete, I'm blocking on his name at the moment, the Chief of Staff, McDermott, he called for a meeting with the progressives, and we talked to him on the phone. There were about 30 of us talked to him on the phone, and said, you know, that we had a lot of feelings about this, and we didn't want this and this. I suggested to him that the President ought to go to the United Nations on the 23rd. On the 23rd of September, the United Nations, all the heads of state in the world congregate in New York City for the opening of the General Assembly. And I said, he should go, and he's certain of his case, and he's confident in it. He should make his presentation to the world, and we shall see how the world reacts to this. Because if you go on your own, unilaterally, it has no support from underneath. But if you have support from the world, or you have support from the Congress, you then have a basis on which to move forward, and it puts the President in a much stronger position. And I think that they are now considering this. The Saudis have even suggested that this be brought to the General Assembly. The argument about using diplomacy, because right now this issue is framed as we will either do an airstrike or nothing. People say, well, we can't do nothing. Well, isn't there anything else besides an airstrike? Yes, it's called diplomacy. Now, the argument the administration makes in that, and I've talked to Samantha Powers, and I've talked to a lot of people in the administration about this thing. They say, well, the Russians have killed everything in the United Nations. We can't get anything done there because they just stop everything. No, 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 veto, veto, veto. And the General Assembly does not have the power to authorize action. It only has the power to make a recommendation to the Security Council that such and such a thing be done. So moving from the morass of the Security Council and moving to the floor of the General Assembly is really to get around the obstructionism of the Soviets. And it's my view that this is an issue that should be argued on the highest level. I think that we as a world have got things that trouble us all, and they must be resolved. And we say we believe in a democracy. We say that. But the question is whether we really want the people to decide what ought to happen. And that's really what's at issue here is, are the people going to have a say in what happens, or is it just going to be a few people at the very top who make the decisions and we move forward? And I personally am uncomfortable with that. I believe in a democracy. I believe that even though I have to listen to a lot of people, and I have to listen to some I don't agree with, or some I don't think are very smart, or whatever I think, I have to listen to them. Because as a representative of them, I have to know who the people are and what they're thinking about it. And that's really the reason for having this meeting tonight. And I just say just one line, and I suppose I could say it later, but I could say it now. I'm leaning against voting for it. I'm very strongly leaning. The press immediately asks, well, is there any circumstance under which you would change your mind? Well, I'm a physician, and I know that you never know everything about a patient. You never know everything about a condition. And you keep gathering information because sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes you made a mistake. Sometimes you didn't pay attention. You didn't see something. I believe you have to keep an open mind until the time comes when we have to have a vote. We will have that vote probably, I would think, in the last week in September. And I'm really here tonight to let people tell me what they think about the options, what they think about limited strike options, whether they think it's in the national interest. There are all kinds of issues that have been raised. And people have said, well, we're doing it for this reason, or we're doing it for that reason, or we're doing it in our national interest, or we're doing it because we have to make a statement, or we have a moral high ground, or there's all kinds, and I'm really here to open the mic, and I think there's a mic someplace around here, and stand up, Jason. Jason's got a mic, and you can start walking down the aisle, and if people would like to make statements. Now, let me just say one thing about this. I hope that we in the House try to limit one another to 3 minutes, okay? I know you may have in mind to make
90 seconds.
90 seconds, is that the one we're going to use? Okay. We would like you, if you want to ask a question, that's one thing, or if you just want to make a statement, either way. But please try and remember that there are a whole bunch of sweating people in here who might also want to talk. So when you get the microphone in your hand, hold it for 90 seconds and pass it on. Okay, ready to go?
Sure.
Pick anybody. Start. We'll come to the back, okay? And if there's some of you in the balcony who would like to ask questions, you may come down and we'll try and deal with you in the aisle here.
Yeah.
Oh,
There's a microphone.
There's a microphone upstairs? Okay, good.
I'm from the Middle East, and I'm really concerned about what exactly is the vision of the United States foreign policy in the area in general. We go into Iraq, and then we make a mess in Iraq, and then we go into Libya, and then we make a mess into Libya. Now we want to go into Syria and make it. So what exactly are we trying to shape in the Middle East? That's number one. Number two is, how do we know that really Assad used the chemical weapons against his own people? Where did we get it from? Maybe we see videos of people in pain, and I don't minimize that at all, but how do you know that it was Assad actually who did that, and it's not a false flag operation?
Okay. The question the gentleman asked is a very common one. How do we know what actually happened? And I must confess that I am receiving information in the same way you are, from the press, from various emails, from YouTube, from every imaginable source, and my staff and we're getting phone calls and we're getting emails and so forth. We don't know some of the answers to that, and one of the reasons why I wanted to slow this process down was what I saw happen in 2002 when we had inspectors in Iraq examining whether there were weapons of mass destruction there, and the administration was so eager to go to war, they wanted to go before the report ever came in. And there is now a group on the ground making studies about what has happened and the best information that can be had. And their report will come out in the next week or so. I think waiting is not a bad thing. One of the interesting things, and one of the things that made me, the president, when he decided to move to have the Congress vote, quoted General Dempsey as saying, this is not a time-sensitive issue. It does not have to be done tomorrow or on Tuesday or on Thursday. It can take some time for us to actually figure out what we're doing and what we think we're going to have as a result. My question always has been in this is not what will it look like on the day we have an airstrike, because you'll see smoke and things flying around and whatever. The question is, what will you have in 5 days or 10 days? And where will we be at that point? And that's really why I want to go slowly. If we're going to do it, if it's going to happen, then we ought to all understand, because we send our troops out to do that. We take responsibility for what they do. And it's the highest decision that I have to make. I can make decisions about taxes and about health care and about a lot of stuff very easily by comparison to sending people to war and creating collateral damage and all of what happens. Yeah, next one. What is the vision of the U.S. foreign policy?
Besides taking the oil from
I think I understand your question, and I guess the problem with that question is that there are a whole lot of actors in that play that we have not listened to or talked to, and nobody's laid it all out, and what we're presented with is one narrow item at a time, and that's we often wind up with this kind of question being put before the Congress. The broader issue of what we want in terms of peace, or what we want in terms of stability, or what we want in terms of democracy, is much more muddled. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, you have to ask yourself, what was the purpose of that? And I don't think that's clear, and we could have a whole evening's discussion about that issue. We're talking tonight about whether or not we go into Syria with bombs and whatever.
Okay, I think that there is another alternative. If we really care for the children and the women and the people, why don't we use all this money and all this energy to take care of the refugees?
In answer to, or in response to the ladies, I absolutely agree. I think this country can do humanitarian things that would make very good sense in terms of helping Jordan, which is dealing with 1 million refugees, and the Turks are dealing with refugees, and I think that there are things that we ought to be doing rather than spending our money on weapons. Yes?
Actually,
No. Give it. Is there one in the balcony? Okay. Yep. Wait, we'll figure that out. We'll do one down here.
is this mic on? It is.
Can't hear you.
Okay.
How you doing? My name is Jamil. I graduated from the UW here, work at the bookstore. Just a local guy, live down the street. I'm kind of concerned that your sources are the same as mine, YouTube. However, I have a great channel I want to give you. Good one for you to check out. So here's my concern. I'm an American history major from UW, and I'm actually learning a lot about American history a lot more out of school than when I was in school, actually, thanks to YouTube. Now, one of the things that I've been learning through this YouTube thing here is the involvement of these banks. Now, to kind of address the earlier question there about what's the U.S. foreign policy, and I really do think it actually is connected to Syria and what we're talking about tonight. What exactly is the involvement, I mean, coming from somebody who stays a lot of time on the Hill there, of these international banks, and how does that really play out in a foreign policy here in the Middle East? And are we really a proxy for something that we don't really know about, like you said earlier, to kind of diagnose the situation there? Thank you so much.
One of the things that you raise is the speech made by Dwight David Eisenhower as he left office, in which he talked about the military-industrial complex and the problems that will perhaps create for us. We have been almost continuously at war since Korea, if you look back at our history, and the military-industrial complex is very tough to deal with. And when an issue like this comes along, in fact, I think it would be safe to say they didn't want to go into Iraq because they couldn't figure out how they could win that one. But they did. They are now poised again to be drawn into this, and the people who make money from this are the military-industrial complex, the merchants of death, the people who make bombs and weapons of all sorts. And there is that problem in all of what we have as a foreign policy. It is sort of sub rosa. Nobody talks about that. But in fact, it's part of what some of us look at this situation and say, we're just stepping into it again, and we don't know what the next one will be. I put this map up here just because I wanted to remind people how big Iraq is and who their neighbors are. And there's Iran next to them, and Jordan south, their little old country, and Israel's in there, and Lebanon's in there, and the Turks are up there. And you are stepping into a situation where you do not know what next Friday will look like. That's what troubles me most, is that map. That's why I put that map up. I put that map up 10 years ago on Syria. My staff found it in a file. And I said, let's bring it along again and put it up again, because it says what is at least a part of what we are struggling with. So, next question.
Well, I don't have a question, just a comment. There are 100 and...
You got to talk right. You got to talk right into the microphone.
Okay, I'll try. There are 189 countries that signed a prohibition of development, producing, stockpiling, and the use of chemical weapons and their destruction. We, and I agree with you about going to the United Nations, should lobby them to get up and do something about the chemical weapons strikes. We, the United States, can no longer be the policeman of the world.
Thank you. Yes. Next question. Oh, we're upstairs? Okay.
Why don't we take about 3 here and switch them off? Is that all right? We got the sound up here now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, Congressman McDermott, thank you for representing us. I live in your district. My name is Nelson Chen. And I just want to voice my opposition to this war with Syria. The reason for this is even though the use of chemical weapons on the civilians are horrible by the Assad regime, the rebels aren't as saints as they're made out to be by the media. If they had chemical weapons themselves and they had the capability to use them, they will use them in a heartbeat. And this war has morphed into a proxy war between Al-Qaeda, which is the rebels, and Hezbollah, which is the Assad regime. And so getting us involved is going to make things way more complicated than what it's already been. And it's going to be, 60 days is not going to be enough time, and it's going to be an open-ended war. And the way things are going with the administration, it seems like we're watching the movie Groundhog Day. I mean, the Obama administration has become like the Bush administration preceding it. I mean, President Obama is seemingly acting more like George Bush, John Kerry like Dick Cheney, Chuck Hagel is Donald Rumsfeld, and so on. So I just really don't want to see us get involved in this conflict.
Thank you. Up there.
Okay, I didn't know if you were going to respond. As somebody who spent their early 20s looking for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, I'm extremely cautious about the possibility of us getting involved in another war. You might want to hold your applause. The issue, though, is that we're not debating whether or not chemical weapons actually exist. They do exist. And if we look at Iraq and we wonder why we didn't need to go into Iraq in 2003, it's because Iraq no longer had its chemical weapons infrastructure. The reason it didn't have that infrastructure is because in the mid-90s, Bill Clinton used airstrikes to take out the Iraqi chemical weapons infrastructure. Could you explain why this would be different than the usage of airstrikes in the mid-90s by Clinton to take out the chemical weapons in Iraq?
I will have to admit that I'll have to go and look and see if historically you're correct that Bill Clinton did that. I know that we gave weapons or gave the precursors for weapons to Saddam Hussein to use against the Iranians, and I'm not sure how that ended. Again, the interesting thing about the last man's comment and your comment is you always keep finding out that somebody did something before that led to this, which led to that, which led to this, which led to that. And the question is, should you do another one? Or should you stop and say, no, we're not gonna get into that. One of the things I find most difficult here is that everybody talks about what a terrible man Assad is. Yes, okay, let's take him to the International Criminal Court and try him there. We haven't signed it. The United States did not sign Bill Clinton signed us into the International Criminal Court, and George Bush took us out. And so my view is that we have to look, sometimes you have to look at yourself and say, well, now, what are we actually doing here? You remember Pogo said, we have found the enemy and they is us. Sometimes looking at ourselves and what we're doing makes us a better image for the rest of the world because we're actually walking the talk that we want others to follow. That's a very difficult problem.
You are absolutely correct in saying that the first step should be to go to the United Nations General Assembly. We have to get the opinion of the world with us and the free and open debate, and we have to do that in order to give prestige to the United Nations. Now, people here are hearing the word airstrike. It's more than an airstrike, it's an air war. The administration spokesmen on television have said that they intend to destroy the air command and control, the air defenses, the planes on the ground, the airfields, the arsenals, the depots, and then they're going to find out that in World War I, poison gas was delivered by artillery canisters, and so they're going to have to go after the artillery and tanks as well. It is really a war on the Syrian government. And I think the casualties would be grossly disproportionate to those who have already been lost. Now, in the long term, I would take another analogy. We got involved in 1952 in Iran when Mossadegh was trying to manipulate to power, and he was trying to create a dictatorship, and we helped him overthrow and put in the Shah. Well, people welcomed it. But in a few years, the Shah became a ruthless dictator, and the next generation hated us for it, and Khomeini drew on that to create in Iran the dictatorship we now have. Think not 5 to 10 days, but 5 to 10 years, and the things that can happen. Thank you.
The situation that faces us in this map behind us, where you have Hezbollah in one place, and you have Iranians over here, and you have all this stuff, and it is not clear that going in and taking out the Assad government will make it a better situation. It's simply not clear. It is not black and white. So, at that point, you have to make a decision about how much more mayhem you want to begin creating in the area. I could give another analogy, which I know very well. When I was in the State Department, I lived in Congo. And 7,000 people a month die and have died for the last 10 years. 7 million people have died in Central Africa, and we haven't done a thing. when you come to the question, the first question was asked, what is our foreign policy? It becomes very murky. We did not go into Rwanda, as was suggested, because we were kind of burned in Somalia, and we have continued to let that situation fester in ways that are awful. But so then we come to this one and we say, this one we're going to step on. This one we're going to respond to. Well, I would like to have a discussion about on what basis is this one, what's the goal, what are we going to have at the end of the line, what will we say we've accomplished? And that's where I come out is what are we doing? I put a little provision in the bill on regulation for banks on conflict minerals, trying to stop conflict minerals from Central Africa winding up in your cell phone and my cell phone, and as a way of cutting off the money. And these issues are extraordinarily complicated when you start into them, and I wish there was a simple answer for this one. There isn't. Yes.
Representative McDermott, I'm here because you already know, and you need it emphasized to you, that of the 0.7 million you represent, I am far from the only one to figure that the only goal rationally pursued by, let us not mince words, making war on Syria is showing that we are a capable aggressor state. Please respond.
Well, you know, you raise a very complicated question. What is our national image? What do we see? We say we're a democracy, but then we like to flex our muscles and show the world that we control, or we can control, or we can stop, or we can start. So we have a somewhat conflicted view of who we are, and we often, and I think, err on the side. We got into, I mean, I'm here because of Vietnam. I was in that war, not over there. I was here dealing with casualties coming back. We got into that war because the French got blasted at Dien Bien Phu, and America said, well, you know, the French, they can't handle anything. We'll fix it. And so we got in, and lo and behold, there we were, and we now have a wall in Washington with 56,000 people's names on it. As a testament to our belief that our power can always solve everything. And I don't believe that. That's why I believe in the diplomacy. For those of you who like to read books, there's a book called Endless Enemies, written by a guy named Jonathan Whitney, who worked for NPR. And he talks about how America picks its leaders around the world and then backs them forever until they're not worthless, and then we throw them out and put another one in. I was given that book by people when I was going off with the State Department. They said you should read it because the first 7 chapters are about Mobutu and what he did in the Congo, and how we backed him, gave him billions of dollars, just so we could use the Congo for whatever purposes we wanted to use it. And there is a very serious question, the deepest question here is our foreign policy. But unfortunately, right now, it is a question of, shall we bomb there? And that's why it is a very tough thing to sort out which factors one should take cognizance of when you're making that decision.
What's the title of that book?
It's called Endless Enemies. Yeah.
Congressman, as my congressman, I would ask that you do more than just lean against military intervention into Syria. I would ask that you use Congress's power of the purse to open up that black ops budget, find out what kind of money we've been sending into by way of our CIA, by way of Saudi Arabia, and all of our others, to orchestrate this problem, and at whose say? I have a hunch, like some of the previous speakers, it's about money, people with big money. It's about us, again, being a useful idiot for every scoundrel in the world.
I'll remember that the next time the CAA budget comes up. I vote no. Go ahead. No, let's take one more down here.
Hi, Jim. My name's David Ludden. I'm grateful that you're my representative. And what I want to say with respect to my Syrian brothers and sisters back here, I'm a compassionate individual, passionately so, and I feel for their people. What I don't think is, while we're taking away food stamps from poor children, while we're enriching the richest 1% of this country, which is ultimately the goal of the military-industrial complex that you mentioned, I don't think these things allow us to go in there, first of all. Second of all, I remember a guy a couple of thousand years ago that said, "Let he who be without sin throw the first stone." So let's make sure that we're clean before we go cleaning up somebody else. I think we can do a hell of a lot more for Syrian people who have escaped Syria than we can for those in Syria. And I think we can do it without endangering the United States' interests. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, in the balcony.
Okay. My name is David Trujillo. I am a constituent of yours here in Seattle. I don't know how I would describe myself politically, but I kind of a radical in many ways. But I definitely support the president in a lot of ways. I was in Florida for my college, and I supported him, as a fellow in 2012 very strongly. And it was the most crucial part of Florida, so I think I definitely have an impact on re-electing him. Nevertheless, I'm completely opposed to his plan to bomb Syria, and let me explain to you why. I'm a political science major, and I've been studying political science for a while and looking at what really determines the outcomes in the political process as far as what actually happens in the political system. And one thing I've discovered is that very rarely the official sort of discourse about what is happening and what our reasons are for doing things are the actual reasons we're doing the things. For us to talk about chemical weapons, to me, is completely absurd because we used napalm in Iraq. My friend from Syria here spoke about napalm and white phosphorus. We used napalm in Iraq, and we watched as the Israelis used white phosphorus on the Gazans in 2009. So for us to talk about chemical weapons, it's just nonsense. It's bullshit. And it's not the reason why we would think to be going in. There is no strong human rights lobby within the U.S. government, especially in the area of foreign policy. If we look at other areas of policy, like domestic policy, we can see that it's the same thing. Like, human rights groups don't have a lot of influence. They definitely don't. It's always other reasons why we do things. The food stamp program, for example, which I totally support, does not survive because of human rights pressure from groups which do lobby on it. It survives because of pressure from Walmart, from food distributors, from other groups that have a lot more money, much more organized. They're the reason it survives, because they get a lot of money from this. I don't believe in any way that this is about chemical weapons. I don't think so at all. I think it's about geopolitics, for one, because we've hated Syria for a long time, and we want to get them out of the picture because they're allied with Iran. They supported insurgents in Iraq. They have been an enemy of Turkey and a pain in Turkey's butt for a long time. They have supported Israel's people who are against Israel, like Hezbollah. So I completely don't like. I hate the Assad regime, and I hate the Syrian regime, and I completely want the Syrian revolution to succeed. However, if we went in there,
I think you've extended your 3 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll cut it short as soon as I can. If we went in there, I'm very bad at. I barely give speeches. Excuse me. If we went into Syria, I think the consequences could be disastrous. The Saudis and the Israelis are in favor of our strikes because they would benefit from a new regime. The Russians are against it. The Chinese are against it. The Turks are probably going to be for it. So what this could do would be to draw in all these different actors into a very volatile situation that could explode, and who knows what consequences there could be. And as someone who is invested in our...
Thank you. Okay. I want to move on to the next one.
Last sentence.
Thank you. I hear you. I hear your point, but I don't want you to keep going on because we got people down here waiting. Thank you. Yes, go ahead. Look, we have to be fair to everybody, and I've given you more than your 90 seconds. Go ahead.
Representative McDermott, ladies and gentlemen. One of the things I learned when I was a kid is that things are not always as they appear, and you can't always trust what you hear. And I thought the last gentleman really explained thoroughly the different forces at work which mold our foreign policy. He's right. It's not about helping anybody. I wish I could say it was, but as far as I know, our entire foreign policy history has not demonstrated that. And let me be even more frank. We're all sitting or standing on stolen ground here. At one point, this belonged to the Native Americans. But I think there's hope. Not the kind of hope that Obama talked about. I don't know what kind of hope that was. A different kind of hope. Because all of these people here, all of us here tonight, demonstrate that we do not accept this kind of a geopolitical order. We have a dream for a better world. Now, some people might think that's naive. I don't think so. You know, as a child, another thing I learned was the story of the boy who cried wolf. And in that story, when people are telling you something to make you afraid over and over again, eventually it loses its power. And you realize, hopefully, that there really isn't anything to be afraid of. So I think we should all take a deep breath right now and try to go back to that place we were in before 9/11, before this dark cloud of fear settled over this country. I think we can go there if we want to.
I appreciate your saying that, and I'm going to cut you off, but I agree with you that what has happened in this country at 9/11, prior to 9/11, we did not believe anybody could ever hurt us or threaten us or do anything to us. We were America. And we lived in this bubble that sort of was impregnable. And suddenly somebody stuck a pin in it, and suddenly we lost everything, and we started the Patriot Act, and we started all these things that have come out of that as a result of our fear. And I believe that we do have to regain our feet and say we have nothing to fear but fear itself. As Franklin Roosevelt said, it is essential for us not to react to everything as though that's the end of the known world as we've come to know it, because we've got all kinds of things that we could have responded to, didn't. Some we respond to, some we don't, and that's why we have to look at this issue in the depth that we're now doing. And I appreciate you being here. Next question.
Hi, Representative McDermott. My name is Alex Martin. Earlier you asked us a question: how do we solve the Syrian problem? I do not want to see the Assad regime remain in power. However, I'm here to tell you that military strikes are not a solution to the Syrian problem. First of all, the idea of a limited strike. Such a strike is not sufficient to contain chemical weapons on the ground. For the U.S. to attempt to influence the Syrian situation through military force would require a full-scale invasion. And if we do, I think that is dangerous for Syria, that is dangerous for the U.S., that is dangerous for the region. That is not good for the Syrian people. While there are secular fighting forces on the ground within the Free Syrian Army, by and large, they have not been militarily effective. There are not fighting forces that the U.S. can effectively aid which will solve the problem in Syria. Additionally, this represents a dangerous ramping up between Russian and American tensions. The positioning of the US and Russian fleets in the Mediterranean recently is frankly frightening. I want to encourage you to stay strong in your decision to vote no on the war in Syria.
Hello. Hi, my name is Anastasia. And I just have to say that this whole Syria war is just a complete trap. The whole thing is a complete trap. Because just like other folks have been saying, this is going to spark a thermonuclear world war. Right? And before we start going around and bombing the hell out of everybody else, you know, we should really look at what our own president has been doing. We've been killing people all around the world with drones. We've gone into illegal wars already. Right? And so instead of, you know, sitting here arguing about something like this, we should be thinking about where's our nation going to be going? One, we need to get industry and manufacturing back into the United States, right? We need to start massive reindustrialization. And two, Obama needs to be impeached. Will you impeach Obama?
I'm not going. I hope they didn't cut me off. I'm not going to that last line. But I do think that we have to have this kind of discussion so the president can see it. That's what these cameras here are all about, is to carry to the country that in Seattle, this is what people think. And I think that the coming to a decision on an issue like this is very difficult, but very important that we have the public discussion. People say something more. I don't think the president should be impeached, frankly. That's my view. But I do think the president has lots of enemies, and my view is that it's very important, and I said this to his staff when we were talking. I said, look, the president of the United States should not want to go out there all by himself and attack Syria. What he wants, what he should want, is to have the support of the members of the Congress. And if he can't convince them that this is the right thing to do, then he might want to, you know, that old country western song about you know when to fold them and you know when to hold them and get away from the table. And this is an issue where I think the president needs to listen to what you and what the congressional members are saying before he goes out there alone, because it is not a good thing for him to do it alone. He is not king. We got rid of a king. We got an elected leader that we put up there, and we have the ability to take the king down or support as we see fit. And that's a much more difficult form of government. Kings, Assad has the ability to say, you didn't do right, we're going to take you out and get rid of you. He can do that, but the president does not have that power, and I think that we have to encourage everybody to be involved in the decision making so that he understands he either does have the support of the people or he doesn't. And if he doesn't, he better think long and hard about what he's doing. Next question.
Let's go ahead. Thanks. Hello. I have a short statement I'd like to read. Much discussion over whether we should intervene in Syria is based around this polarization of militarized loyalists of Assad versus violent rebels with links to al-Qaeda. I want to make sure that everyone is aware that there is much more to the rebellion than this. There's a huge network of nonviolent resistance groups in Syria actively working for peace and self-determination. The Syria Nonviolence Movement made an interactive map that can be viewed online, outlining labor unions, art coalitions, youth and student groups, town councils, public education campaigns, etc., that are working to end the killing and allow the Syrian people to reform the government as best serves them. Aside from that, Obama's push for punitive military strikes disturbs me. Military strikes too often result in the death and displacement of civilians, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. Furthermore, if the goal is to punish or oust Assad, this likely won't in itself resolve the Syrian people's struggle for true democracy. Remember Egypt, where Mubarak was replaced with Morsi, and we know how that turned out. Simply ousting Mubarak without altering his regime's institutions did not result in true democracy, and I fear the same thing could happen in Syria. I don't feel the US has tried enough diplomatic solutions to the crisis. My proposal, as an alternative to military strikes, is to provide aid to the Syrian refugees, pressure Russia to allow the Syrian people to determine their own future, and push for Assad to be tried by the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
She'll make a good member of Congress. She wrote her speech down to keep it short. Go ahead.
My name is Phil Welt. I live locally, and I'd also like to say that I'm very proud to have you as my representative and have been for many years. I like to think that I am an ethical person and feel for the suffering of others. Also, as a father of a young child, I shudder whenever I see pictures of children needlessly killed without any reason. On the other hand, I am a believer in foreign politics, in something called realpolitik. I think there are a lot of bad actors in the world, and I think that the U.S., to get where it wants and what it wants in the world, what I want in the world long term, has to think in its interests. Precisely for that reason, I am very against this strike in Syria, as I was against the involvement in Iraq and as I was against the involvement in Afghanistan. I formed that opinion, but then I read an article by a man you may know named Ryan Crocker, and people who are interested can find this on the web at Yale Global Syria. And Ryan Crocker is a retired ambassador to count them six, of the countries on that map: Pakistan, Lebanon, Kuwait, Iraq, Syria, and most recently he came out of retirement to be ambassador to Afghanistan. And what Ryan Crocker does in this short article is he does compare the situation to Bosnia, and he compares it to other situations. He further points out that this conflict between the Assad government and the people who are there has been going on since the 80s. This is precisely the conflict that caused 140 Marines to lose their lives in a bombing in 1982 or 83. And I commend to people that article, and I believe that the people closest to the situation have the best insight about what to be done. And when a man of that tenure and with that experience as an ambassador says, this is crazy to do, I pay a lot of attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one in the balcony.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate a lot of the comments from people, but I think the discussion around whether we should strike Syria it's not an honest discussion if it's kept just around Syria. I think you're very aware, given all of your experience, that there are many geostrategists who have laid out plans for toppling various regimes. We've seen it carried out under Bush and Obama. I mean, you know about people like Bernard Lewis and the Sam Huntingtons. And their ultimate agenda is to encircle Russia and China and pit the United States and Europe against those two nations who, frankly, there's no reason why we should be enemies with these countries. Now, it's important to think about that because I think what's not really being discussed, one lady brought it up, is the danger of nuclear war. And I want to make two references. One, to Robert Kennedy's 13 Days, because in that book, he actually lays out how a nuclear war would happen. And what he says is that it's not as if somebody's going to wake up one day and decide we're going to have nuclear war. He says it's going to happen because of a miscalculation or a misjudgment. Now, I'll also want to reference the statements by the Russian military leadership, the former General Makarov from about a year ago, but also the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev. I believe it was in St. Petersburg in May of 2012, where he laid out the warning that these local or regional conflicts could actually escalate into larger strategic conflicts that could result in nuclear warfare. And I think that's the thing that's not being discussed, and I think you have a responsibility as a leader, not just for people in Seattle, but for the nation and the world, to make this discussion the forefront of what's happening in the Congress. And when you go back to DC tomorrow, instead of actually talking about whether we're going to strike Syria or not, you need to talk about impeaching Obama, because he's already a war criminal. And he doesn't really care. He doesn't care if the Congress gives him authority. He's already done it before in Libya, and I'm sure he'll do it again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hear that there needs to be a larger discussion from the very first question about what American policy is, and I agree with it. There are many aspects of it which I'm uncomfortable with, and I constantly have to figure out on a daily basis of how we change the direction of what's going on. It is really a major issue that this country has not faced, is what is our relation going to be in the world? Are we going to be the policeman that runs and stops everything we don't like? Or are we going to abandon? Or are we going to have certain areas where we care about it and certain areas we don't? I mean, there are a whole series of questions that I think are sitting before us and are really not being addressed. Unfortunately, right now we're mired in things in the Congress that make no sense at all. And I really think that you're raising a very good point. Next question.
Congressman, friends, let's make a couple assumptions for a moment here. I don't believe any of these things, but let's assume that they're true for the moment. One, that our hands are entirely clean, that our motives are totally pure, that this has nothing to do with Iran. Let's assume that we can have a military strike that will only kill guilty people. Let's assume that this would all work, that Assad would be removed, that everything would be sunshine. Well, that's the thing. We can't make that assumption, because violence is a terrible teacher. If you want to get a message across to the whole wide world about chemical weapons, violence is a terrible teacher. History shows us that the only way that these cycles of violence are broken is with compassion. Somebody mentioned Rwanda. The reason we haven't seen Rwanda in the news since is because they became aware of that, and they put forward a real effort at reconciliation. So there really aren't any good options today. There really aren't. And the bottom line is that the American government, through its continual use of violence, has kind of poisoned the well in the Middle East. There's not a whole lot that the American government can do. But there's a lot that Americans can do. I think the government's job is to stand back and let people work for peace.
I don't disagree with you. I think the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is one that leads to two blind men. That's really what happens. And I really think that that's why you're absolutely right. And the question is, if you decide not to do an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, you gas the people, so we're going to blast you with our munitions. If you're not going to do that, then what is the next step? And perhaps the steps proposed by people in terms of dealing with refugees and some of these other issues are much more akin to the way we as Americans think of ourselves and we actually ought to act. Thank you. Next question. I'm going to take two more questions, and then I've got to go. So I'm sorry for those of you who have stood in line, but I can't wait till ever. Go ahead.
Okay, I want to say that you should definitely vote against this. The United States government has no moral authority to tell anybody to do anything. As Martin Luther King said in 1967 in his Riverside speech, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world is the United States government. This government is going around the world to dominate the world for the economic interests of its large corporations. That's what the foreign policy of the United States government is. I would invite you, and I would invite everybody here, to become an opponent of the U.S. empire. Not to say, what should the empire do? Should it do diplomacy? Should it do war? Should it do this? Should it do that? We should be opposed to this empire and try to get rid of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll make mine very fast for the lady behind me. A, we have not been elected as the policeman of the world. B, we have no moral duty to protect anybody but our own country. If we do have a moral duty, then we should be protecting North Korea. And lastly, for the person who said violence is always bad, I do not think Gandhi would have survived against Adolf Hitler and the SS.
I just want to say that I think it's so important that people came out tonight, and we must not waste the humanitarian thoughts that we do have for the people in the world. I'm thinking that Obama is going to listen to people. Okay, October 6th is the anniversary of when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, a totally innocent country. I'm so glad people brought up the fact that the U.S. has used chemical weapons from napalm to Agent Orange to white phosphorus. There's no reason anybody here should think the U.S. is going in for any humanitarian reason. It's for global imperialist power plays to maintain their dominance around the world. So we need to unite.
One last question.
My name is Mark Drummond. I'm with the Freedom Socialist Party. And Congressman, since you're a physician, I'd want to tell you about a new affliction affecting Americans. It's called the Iran-Afghanistan syndrome. The American people do not want another war of choice. Our government has shown time and time again that it cannot act responsibly with the war machine it has at its disposal. We have to look at how this all started. It was an extension of the Arab Spring. To disrupt it, we funded Islamic militants to start an armed conflict. We've already done enough. We don't need to do any more. Now President Obama wants to contain the civil war in Syria and the Arab Spring in order to guarantee a favorable outcome to U.S. imperialism, using this gas attack as an excuse. It's not humanitarianism. It's a cold, calculated, devious manipulation that will lead to greater suffering for the Syrian people and the defeat of the revolution they are trying and dying to make. The Freedom Socialist Party condemns the U.S. intervention in Syria, regardless of the guise in which it's delivered. The U.S. war machine and its humanitarian ruling class supporters at home and abroad share no common interest with the Syrian people. Freedom for Syrians will be won by the Syrian people themselves, just as working people of the United States must fight for and win our own freedom from our own corporate masters. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I have got to go. I have to get up early in the morning and go catch a plane, and I got to get some sleep before I do it, because tomorrow we're going to be back in Washington going to secret briefings about all of this stuff. Or we're going to briefings. I don't go to secret briefings, and I'll tell you why I don't. I don't want to go to a briefing where I find out something that I now know but I can't tell anybody. Doesn't make any sense to me. Never has. And I appreciate all of you, your being here and sharing your ideas with me. I hope that you will continue to do that through the email and through the telephone and whatever means you can. It is an issue that is not done, and we may have another one of these down the road. Thank you very much for coming tonight.